In conventional IT management literature, a very important aspect that we talk about a lot is in terms of information management. Usually, a management falls within certain standards. It is normally an artifact with some systematic and instructional knowledge. That's what I know of on how the information should be and can be managed in organization. And among the many standards, one that is widely used is the ISO.
Welcome. You are listening to SecurityLAH Podcast, Season 3.
Let's talk about what is a standard and then what's ISO. So, Doc, can you share with us what is a standard?
Okay, so before we start off, I just want to make it clear that this standard that we're referring to is a document that's available for anyone to consume. It should not be confused with policy, governance, standards, SOPs for an organization. These are standards or reference document that's applicable to anyone and everyone who wants to get it. So what is the standard? So the standard gives you information about a particular topic. So today we talk about cybersecurity, IT security, network security, and the whole works. So we are referring to a document that, well, for ISO standards, you have to purchase this document. It's not something that's freely available for download. So it's a copyrighted document that you can purchase and use in your organization. So standards tell you what should be done, or in a lack of better word, gives you a frame on how you can make sure that you've done what you need to do. So another way I could answer this question is, say, Prof, you go into a new organization and you're the CISO. So the board asks you, have we done enough? How do we know that we're doing everything we need to do? So the best way to answer this question is to say that let's do a gap analysis, or let's identify if the organization actually meets a particular standards. Now, standards can be something that is issued by your local government. It can be a regulatory requirement, or you can even use a standard that is accepted worldwide. In this case, we refer to the ISO standards, the International Standards Organization. So that's in a way how you could answer that question. But if an organization is already having a standard, then you can use that standard to say, what have we done in totality for the organization? How far have we gone? And what are the areas that we need to do in order to cover the gaps that we see?
Okay. You talk about standards organizations and also ISO. Are they the same? What's the difference between them, if not?
So we have standards organization and we have ISOs. ISO is a group of 167 countries, and these countries are represented by their standards organization. So for example, in Malaysia, you have a standard organization called SIRIM, SIRIM. They are responsible in producing local, albeit national standards specifically for Malaysia. Right? You also have standards organization that operates in other countries like in Singapore and Indonesia and India, who in their own way produce standards specifically for their country. I guess the one that's really famous that everyone knows about is NIST. NIST, which is from the United States of America. They produce a lot of, I call them as bleeding edge, or, really on the cusp kind of standards that influence how a lot of other organizations do their work, right? So in some countries, you have to meet your local standards requirements or your regulatory requirements. So let me put a frame here. Standards are not mandatory. Regulatory requirements are mandatory, because regulatory requirements may be a condition for you to meet your licensing requirement. Now, however, a regulation or a law can stipulate that you must meet the minimum requirement or the baseline, or even to meet the audit requirements of a particular ISO or a local standard. It really depends on that country and how they want to promulgate standards and a certain level of assurance in whichever area that they want. So let me give you an example. So when we talk about standards, I'm a tea lover, right? International Standards Organization, or ISO, has ISO 3103 specifically on how to make a cup of tea.
Oh, okay. I didn't know
So
that.
that's very little known thing about how detailed ISO can go. So take my word for it. You can open up Google, punch in ISO 3103, and you will find that document, right? Or at least a reference to that document, which is what I'm doing right now. I just want to read out the title for you. So 3103, standards by ISO, standardized method for brewing tea. That's the title of the document, right? I mean, because I'm a tea lover, so I know there's an ISO
Okay.
standard on how you make tea, but this is the British way of making tea, not the Malaysian way of making teh tarik, right? But there is a standard. So maybe Malaysia might come up and say, this is the mean and the standard requirement on how to make a good cup of teh tarik, right? That can happen.
Hey, interesting. I did a quick one also, and I saw there's one specifically for use in sensory tests. Now that's
Yes.
interesting.
Yes, there is. So I hope I've given you a clear difference
Yeah.
between what a standards organization do, what ISO does. Okay, so maybe I have to branch a little bit into what ISO does. So ISO is a collection of 167 countries, and they're represented by their respective standards organization. So there may be standards that is prevalent at the local country, which the country might find that, hey, I want this standard to go so that everyone would recognize it, because I find benefit in having this standard. It can be a manufacturing standard. It can even be a security standard. So for example, encryption. There are encryption algorithms that are used at national level, and there are encryption algorithm that's used worldwide, right? So if a country were to say, okay, I have this encryption algorithm, which I think is beneficial because it's in everybody's computer, it's being used widely. We want to make sure we have a standard on how people could use this algorithm or this cipher effectively. Hence, we want to standardize it. So that can be a reason why you'd want to take a local standard, or say a standard from a country X, to then be proposed at ISO to become an international standard.
Is it correct to say that, well, just now you said ISO is made of 167 countries, and then, so I would assume that within the countries itself, then there are standards organizations. Then is it right to say that the standards organizations do the work of ISO, as in they carry out the work? Is it correct?
You're absolutely right. So the people who actually do work in ISO are the representatives, the country representatives who are in ISO. So for example, I'm a country representative who does work for ISO. I've written standards, ISO standards, specifically on encryption, and also I'm part of the team that produced the ISO 27000 series, and namely the most recent one, which is the 27001, which was just released in 2022. So we are not paid by ISO. No, I don't get paid in Swiss francs, although I would love that. It's a national service, mind you.
Okay.
So we come as representative from our national body. So, for example, I come representative of my national body in ISO, and I'm also one of the editors in ISO. So these are all, I would say, professional, voluntary work that you know you did the work. And one of the funny things about ISO is that you will never ever see the list of editors or the person who actually contributed to the standards, because it's a collective way of doing work rather than just one person putting in their effort. So there are two types of representatives who work in ISO. The first one is a subject matter expert. So subject matter expert would be the person who would be the check and balance to make sure whatever details that's proposed in the standards meet the actual technical accuracy required for an international standard. So, for example, if you're proposing an encryption algorithm, then the verbiage, how it's described, the test parameters are all properly defined in the document before it goes out into publication. This is at the technical level or at the experts level. The next level is when the standards are voted by the country standards organization. It can be the same person, depending on who's attending the meeting, or it can be a separate person. So there are two levels of verification. The first one is at the experts level, people who understand the technical nitty-gritty details of the subject matter that's being spoken about. Once that gets approved, then it goes to the national level. So at the national level, each country then votes to say whether yes, standard is okay, go ahead, or no, which is just a plain no, or it says no with modification, which means that I would say no, but I'm inclined to say yes if you make these 4 to 5 changes in your document. So it may not just be something technical, it can be something editorial, or it can even be something on how the whole process is being described, because you might be doing it differently in your respective nativity or country.
Okay. Now, I find it interesting that the people who work on ISO, if I understand you correctly, is that they are not acknowledged. We will not see the names of the people who actually work on those standards. Is that a common practice, and what is the rationale for that?
Well, I guess like what I mentioned earlier, it's more of the ISO standard being an international document which doesn't tie to an individual effort but a collective effort. So in that instance, I guess the only thing that would validate if you've done some work is the mention when your document finally gets approved. It actually gets minuted. These are the persons who are responsible for this document. So that's as far as it goes.
Okay.
Because it's an international standard, doesn't. I guess it's also to remove the stigma of whether the standard was authored by a person from country X or country Y. So since it's international, then I guess it's only fitting that there's no names to it, and I guess it's more of a collective or a global effort rather than a singular party effort.
Fair enough. Then my next question would be, how does one get into this team of ISO experts? Does one get voted, or is it an application process?
Enjoying the show so far? Subscribe now so that you don't miss out on the latest episode. We are available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and many other platforms. Visit podcast.securitylah.asia to get the links to subscribe.
So the first thing to do is to be part of your local standards organization community. So each of the standards organization will have their own committee mirroring how the ISO works. So for example, the committee in ISO that looks at cybersecurity is called the SC27, right? So the same structure is there replicated at the local level standards organization. So, for example, in Malaysia, we have SIRIM. SIRIM will have similar structure as to which committee corresponds to which committee in the ISO. So, as part of the standards working group, I'm also there in the local community, reviewing the documents, putting up proposals, helping the other editors, improving the documents. And we work both at the local level and we also work at the international level. That's how it works. So if you want to get into ISO, for example, so let me remind you, you don't get paid in Swiss francs. You get a pat in the back and say, well done, good job, right? So there's a lot of time involved and there's a lot of meetings, especially when a paper starts getting approved. So when the paper goes in the concept level, then first you vote whether the paper should actually go into an actual ISO standard. Usually the challenge is to get that proposal out of the way to say that, yeah, we're going to work on it. And then the standards organization may decide to say, okay, we'll contribute some resources there. Or they may say that this is not something that we're interested and may not even worry about that particular standard. So as part of being in the committee, you can actually decide to say, okay, I raise my hand. I'm going to work on this standard number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and be one of the technical experts. And you start joining in the meetings. Usually there are face-to-face meetings every 6 months. And in between, there may be working group discussions or the paper discussions. Because, for example, the way it's organized, how ISO is organized, you have the main series. So here we have SE27 that looks at the 27,000 series of document, and then it's split into 6 to 7 working groups. So for example, working group 1 is responsible for the main standard 27,001, 27,002. Working group 2 is responsible for looking at encryption and cryptography standards. So you can then be which part of the working group that interests you, and you can be part of that working group, and you can start looking at papers. So within the working group, then you have multiple papers. People may be talking about the next quantum proof encryption. So for example, working group 2, we may be talking about quantum proof encryption, or we may be talking about a new algorithm to be proposed into lightweight HMACs, right? Hash-based message authentication codes. Or you can be in another working group which talks about aviation security. How are we going to build the next generation black box? What kind of encryption capabilities? How do we have that process? That can also be a topic that you look at. So I'm just giving you some of the normal mundane topics, but you'll be surprised to see the vast width of the kind of topics that the standards organization actually gets to.
Yeah, no doubt. I'm lost. But there you go, folks. If you're interested to getting into this committee, you know what to do now. But let's look at the other side, the organizations. What does it mean when an organization claim to be ISO compliant? Assuming compliant is the right word to use.
Okay, so there's a few levels on how you could say you are compliant. You can adopt the standard and you say, yeah, I'm benchmarking myself against ISO 27001. And that's more of a self-attestation type of a setup. Now, obviously, that means very little or nothing to anyone else in the outside because you've not gone through an audit process. We don't know which part of the section of your standards that's applicable. There's a whole series of how an organization gets audited and then gets a certification to say, I have benchmarked myself and I've been audited by this organization. Now, your local standards organization may provide you that facility, or you could use an international auditor such as SGS. BSI, and many others who may offer such a service. Once they've gone through the audit, then they will actually give you a certificate to say you've now benchmarked yourself to an ISO standard, right? So there's two models to it. So the first one is you just raise your hand and say, yeah, I'm benchmarking myself against ISO 27001. Doesn't really carry much weight, to my opinion. It's just saying that, we've done some work on it. But the actual work is where you use a third-party auditor to certify yourself to say that you have met all these requirements. Now, certifying an organization to ISO can be both a good thing, and also to people who are not aware can be also misleading.
Okay. So that means there is no attainment levels, as I know in some standards, the outcome of the audit would actually grade you on a scale where if you're at the highest level of attainment, then you become a role model to other organizations. Is there such a benchmark or comparison?
In ISO, what's important is you demonstrate how you meet compliance to a particular standard. So, for example, we're talking about the ISO 27000 series. You would demonstrate your compliance to ISO 27001 specifically. But it's really up to you to show that you've met a certain control. So, for example, one of the controls in ISO 27001 is your policy document must be reviewed periodically. Very simple statement, doesn't give much, right? In the upcoming episodes on this 27,000 series, we'll go through into more detail, but just giving you a simple example. So then as an organization, you now need to decide, how are you going to meet the requirements of this particular statement? Because the statement is these are motherhood statements. Motherhood statement means they're very wide. It's a wide net to cast, and you can almost hit something. So as long as you have a process to show, or you can show proof that the document has been reviewed, and it's documented somewhere, that I'm just giving an example. It's documented somewhere that all your board level policies are reviewed once a year or per annum, right? And you can actually show that this is my security policy, and my security policy has been reviewed within a year time frame, right?
Okay. Well, it sounds more like a checklist to me, though.
You can treat it as a checklist. That's one way of looking at it. But what's important for an ISO certification process, which we'll go into much detail in the coming episodes, is how you would demonstrate that. Now, the auditor may say that your controls are insufficient based on global best practices. We will go through the audit process, and we'll also explain to you what the audit means when it says that needs for improvement, or it's a finding, it's a recommendation. So we'll go through different ISO audit terminologies in the upcoming series so that you understand the whole process of audit. But the idea of audit is for you to certify and say, for that year or that time frame, you have been able to demonstrate that you have all these controls in place in your organization.
Okay. So my final question to you. But how do organizations know which standards they should go to, particularly in information security and cybersecurity?
The only one document that will be used to certify your organization would be the ISO 27001. That's the only document you have to worry about. But then if you look at ISO, there's close to about 60 over documents, and it's growing. It's not just one document, it's 60 over documents, right? So what about the other documents? Now, the other documents gives you a guide on how you can implement security. So for example, in 27001, we talk about motherhood statements, or in Annex A specifically, we talk about the controls, what the controls are. So one control I mentioned earlier was your policy document must be updated periodically. right?
Mhm.
Now, if you want to know how to do it, then you can refer to ISO 27002. So ISO 27002 gives you per control level what are the suggestions, how could you meet the control requirements in Annex A of 27001. Now be reminded, at any point of time you are only assessed based on ISO 27001. So the first thing any organization should do is, if you are looking at international standards, then just get the ISO 27001 first, understand what the document requirements are. By the way, you have to buy the document. My suggestion is get it from your local standards organization. The contents of the document is exactly the same. The only thing is that if you buy it from the ISO web store, you will pay in Swiss francs, and it's actually much, much more expensive. So the local standards organization have localized, or usually they just add 1 or 2 pages in front to say that this is produced by the local standards organization. And yes, it is a copyrighted document. If you get it from your local standards organization, it's rather affordable, to be honest. And each organization that's looking at cybersecurity or IT security seriously, you should have a license copy, or because these are copyrighted documents. And of course, in cybersecurity, we always preach that you must follow intellectual property rights. So this is a copyrighted document. Get a copy. You will find that if you try to borrow somebody else's document, there would be a watermark on the document that says where you got it from, and it's rather embarrassing if you're doing ISO work and the document reflects someone else's name, right? So you should always make sure you get your own copy so that your name is there and you're allowed to use it. And they have different models as to how these documents can be used in an organization.
Right. Okay, I think that's quite a lot of information on ISO alone. Thank you very much for sharing so much useful information with us. In the coming episode, we will move on from here and to talk about the ISO 27000 series, right, Doc?
Yep. So this what we've planned between myself and Prof is that we don't want SecurityLAH to just be a podcast about what's happening globally, but we want it to be useful for people who've just started security, trying to understand security. And we thought one of the first things that we could do is talk about what is a security standard. It gives you a frame into what are the areas you need to implement for security. And also primarily because ISO has just published the most recent version of the 27001 and 27002, which is just published in 2022. So we thought this would be a great way for us to bring the awareness about this standards document, so that number one, it becomes a reference point for those who are just starting off cybersecurity, so that they can read through, they can understand these are the controls, they understand the whole ISO process, and helps to get that awareness up and running. And the other reason why we specifically chose ISOs, because SecurityLAH is primarily a pan-Asian cybersecurity podcast. And if you look at it, in Asia, there is no Asia standard. So if you're a company that's operating from the US, you most likely will refer to the NIST standards. If you're from the European Union, then ENISA and the relevant standards. If you're a telecommunications agency, you usually refer to ITU-T. Whereas for cybersecurity, we find that if you were to benchmark yourself against your Asian peers, the best way would be to use the ISO standards. Hence, that was the reason why we came up with this whole series. It's going to be a 1-year kind of series. Both Prof and I will be going back and forth on how the ISO standard works, nitty-gritty details. So this is the introductory episode about standards, ISO. In the upcoming episodes, we will dive deeper into different areas that you would want to know about ISO standards. About 27,000 specifically, we will go into the standards document. We will rip it apart. Now, obviously, you will not be able to reconstruct the ISO document from this podcast. So I would suggest that you get a copy, so that as we go through this discussion, you'll find it easy that you have a point of reference, which is the ISO document, and you could actually follow through the discussions and understand what are the security requirements better.
Okay, let's look forward to the next episode then.
All right, see you guys.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for joining us this week on SecurityLAH. Make sure to visit our website at securitylah.asia, where you can subscribe to the show in iTunes, Spotify, or via RSS so you'll never miss a show.